Just because I didn't respond to your group chat message doesn't mean I wasn't busy responding to my attorney. 4 months ago, I finally bought the house I had been dreaming about for my entire life. A stunning, historic $3.5 million coastal estate, perched perfectly on the cliffs of Monterey, California. It was the very first piece of real estate that had only my name on the deed. 2 weeks after I closed, my daughter-in-law posted a message in the family group chat, announcing that her parents were moving into my East Wing. She literally told the entire family that if I didn't like it, I could go back to living in their city apartment. I didn't argue, I didn't type a single word back, not that night and not the next morning. Because 3 weeks earlier, I had already filed a massive stack of legal documents that nobody in my toxic family knew existed. What actually happened on moving day when the trucks pulled up to my gates? None of them saw it coming, especially the part where I handed her an eviction notice for her own luxury apartment. Welcome back to Alpha Mom Stories. This channel is dedicated to the women who spent their entire lives building quiet empires, only to be treated like disposable doormats by the people they funded. If you are new here, every single story is about a woman who stopped accepting the crumbs she was handed and started liquidating the entire bakery. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from today, and be sure to hit that subscribe button. You are absolutely going to want to stick around for this ending. The Monterey estate sits on 3 acres of pristine California coastline. It features floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean, massive vaulted ceilings, and heavy mahogany floors that smell faintly of sea salt and lemon oil. It is not just a house, it is a fortress, and I bought it in March, 4 months ago, entirely in cash. My husband, Thomas, and I had talked about retiring to the coast for years. We used to drive down Highway 1 on our anniversaries, looking at the massive gates hiding the mansions on the cliffs, promising each other we would eventually buy one. We never got around to it. Thomas was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer 5 years ago. It is the kind of illness that does not negotiate. It simply takes its time, and then it takes absolutely everything with it. 3 years ago this September, I buried him after the funeral. I didn't crumble. I didn't break down. I went right back to work, because when your heart is entirely shattered, mathematics and logic are the only things that keep the walls from completely caving in. I was not a retired kindergarten teacher or a sweet old grandmother who baked cookies all day. For 32 years, I was a corporate real estate liquidator. I specialized in dismantling bankrupt commercial empires. When massive hotel chains, luxury development firms, or corporate conglomerates failed, the federal courts called me. I stepped into the absolute chaos, assessed the assets, froze the accounts, and surgically liquidated the properties to pay off the massive debts. I spent 3 decades sitting at the head of massive conference tables, staring down screaming, arrogant male CEOs who thought they could intimidate me. They never could. I understand property law, deed transfers, and asset protection better than most federal judges. I retired last year with a massive pension, a highly structured private investment portfolio, and Thomas's life insurance payout. I had spent my entire life untangling the spectacular failures of other people. What I wanted now was complete silence, not a legacy, not a massive social circle, just the ocean outside my window, and absolutely nobody's schedule but my own. The purchase of the Monterey estate took 11 agonizing weeks. Title searches, coastal commission inspections, and a massive structural issue with the cliffside retaining wall that delayed the closing twice. The asking price was exactly $5 million. I didn't tell a single person in my family how close I came to walking away from the deal. I certainly didn't tell my son, Mark, and I absolutely did not tell his entitled wife, Chloe, not after the incredibly condescending comment Chloe had made at Thanksgiving the year before. She had looked around my modest transitional condo, swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet I had purchased, and sighed, "It must be so nice living on a fixed retirement income, Evelyn. Just simple quiet with absolutely no complex responsibilities." I had smiled at her. The room had laughed. It was the easy kind of laugh people do when they are not entirely sure if something is an insult, but they definitely don't want to find out. I passed the cranberry sauce and didn't correct her. I didn't explain that my fixed retirement income was generating more compound interest in a single week than her interior design business, made in an entire fiscal quarter. I have let a lot of things go over the years: small, pathetic comments, condescending assumptions, the quiet, toxic family habit of deciding that I was the designated scapegoat, the one who would simply endure disrespect because I never raised my voice. But letting go has a very hard limit. I just hadn't found mine until the group chat notification arrived. There is a heavy, fireproof steel safe bolted to the concrete floor in my master closet. It requires a biometric fingerprint scan and a complex 8-digit code to open. Inside it sits a thick navy blue folder. Inside that folder is the deed to the Monterey estate, the comprehensive title insurance policy, and a highly specific set of trust documents drafted by my estate attorney. Thomas had left me with one incredibly clear instruction before he passed away in that sterile hospital room. He held my hand, his grip terrifyingly weak, and looked me directly in the eyes. "Whatever you build after I am gone, Evelyn," he whispered, "you build it so it is yours outright, no joint names, no family sharing, just yours." I hadn't reread the entire trust document since his funeral. I kept meaning to, but what absolutely nobody in my family knew was that the life insurance payout and my liquid savings didn't quite cover the final $3.5 million purchase price after the cliffside retaining wall repairs added an unexpected $400,000 to the closing costs. I didn't ask my son Mark for a single dime. Mark is 34, a junior partner at a boutique architecture firm. He drives a leased Porsche he can barely afford and lives entirely beyond his means to keep his wife happy. Chloe is an aspiring luxury interior designer who spends more time curating her Instagram grid than actually designing anything. Instead of asking them for help, I quietly liquidated a massive commercial warehouse I had owned in secret near the Port of Oakland. A property I had purchased for pennies during a bankruptcy auction 20 years ago. It sold for $1.2 million in pure cash. I took that money, covered the remaining balance on the Monterey estate, and used the rest to quietly purchase the master lease on a highly lucrative piece of residential real estate in the city. I didn't tell a single soul. My family simply assumed Thomas's insurance covered the beach house. I let them assume it. Ignorance is the most expensive luxury toxic people afford themselves. It was the very first house that ever had just my name on the paper. Not Thomas and Evelyn, not a shared family trust split down some legal middle if things went poorly. Just Evelyn Vance, earned in a way nobody in my family had ever bothered to ask about. The message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in May. I was standing on my massive teak deck, watching the Pacific Ocean crash against the rocks below, holding a mug of black coffee. My phone buzzed aggressively on the outdoor patio table. It was a notification from the Vance family group chat. There were 14 of us in that chat: cousins, aunts, my sister-in-law from Sacramento. Chloe had posted a message, complete with 3 party emojis. "Great news, everyone. My parents are officially moving into the east wing of the Monterey house next month. Evelyn barely uses all those massive rooms anyway. We are so incredibly excited for them to finally have some stability and a luxury coastal view." 5 different cousins immediately loved the message. 3 heart emojis followed from relatives who had absolutely no idea what they were actually agreeing to. I set my coffee mug down on the glass table. I read the message twice. I didn't feel angry at first. I felt the cold, precise, calculating chill of a corporate liquidator stepping into a hostile boardroom. I picked up the phone and texted Chloe privately, completely bypassing the group chat. "Chloe, please call me immediately, we need to discuss this." She called within 30 seconds. Her voice was incredibly breezy, light, and perfectly rehearsed. The exact tone of someone who knows they are completely out of line, but plans to confidently bulldoze their way through the conversation. "Hi, Evelyn," Chloe chirped loudly. I figured it just made total sense to let the whole family know the plan. My parents desperately need somewhere stable right now. You literally have an entire east wing, just sitting there collecting dust. Chloe, I said, my voice dangerously calm and entirely devoid of emotion. That is my private home. This is the very first I am hearing about any of this. It really isn't that complicated, Evelyn, she sighed, her tone shifting from breezy to instantly patronizing. They lost their house, you have a massive mansion. I really don't understand why this needs to be a whole dramatic thing. Did you intend to actually ask me, Chloe? Or did you just intend to announce it to 14 people so I would be too embarrassed to say no? There was a heavy, loaded pause on the line. Then her voice sharpened, dripping with absolute entitlement. Look, Evelyn, if you don't like it, you can just go back to the city apartment. You can stay in our guest room. See how it feels for a while instead of hoarding a $3 million estate all to yourself. I didn't answer right away. I looked out at the ocean fun, the massive dark blue water that never asked permission to take up space. It wasn't a request, it was an eviction notice dressed up as a family favor. She had made the decision, announced it to the world, and then offered me the guest room in her apartment as a consolation prize. Thank you for calling me, Chloe, I said softly. I have a lot to think about. I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. Crying is a biological response to pain. I wasn't in pain. I was in planning mode, and Chloe had just made the single greatest miscalculation of her entire adult life. Here is exactly what I knew about Chloe's parents, Richard and Brenda Halloway, before that phone call. 6 weeks earlier, their massive $18 million suburban home had been completely foreclosed on by the bank. Richard, a former regional manager who had retired too early and invested heavily in a failed tech startup, had quietly taken out 3 separate mortgages against their equity. When the housing market shifted and the startup collapsed, the bank came calling. They were given 60 days to vacate. Richard is 61, Brenda is 63. They are not bad people, but they are incredibly careless people who have spent their entire lives living entirely above their means and expecting someone else to quietly cover the check. Since the foreclosure, they had been sleeping on a massive velvet pull-out couch in Mark and Chloe's luxury city apartment. The apartment is a stunning 1,800-square-foot penthouse in downtown San Francisco. It features exposed brick, high-end appliances, and floor-to-ceiling windows. It leases for exactly $8,500 a month, 4 adults crammed into a space built for 2. Some nights when I visited, I watched everyone aggressively stepping around each other, breathing the same recycled air. Losing a home at 61 is incredibly difficult. I want to say that clearly, because what happened later does not erase the trauma of eviction. But I also remembered something else. 4 years ago, before Mark and Chloe were even married, Richard had cornered Mark at a family barbecue. He asked Mark to co-sign a massive $80,000 commercial loan for a new luxury SUV. Richard's credit was completely destroyed even back then. I had pulled Mark's side later that evening. I didn't yell, I didn't command him, I just laid out the mathematics. If you co-sign that loan, Mark, you are legally binding your future to a man who has already bankrupted his past. Mark listened to me. He refused to sign the loan. Richard eventually secured the financing himself with a terrifyingly high interest rate. And he actually managed to make the payments. But Brenda never forgave me for intervening. She never said it to my face. She just let the resentment sit underneath every single interaction we had for 4 years. A toxic silent grudge that she refused to let go. I called Mark that evening. He answered on the 4th ring. There was aggressive background noise, dishes clinking, a television blaring, and Brenda's loud voice complaining about the water pressure in the guest bathroom. "Mom, hey," Mark said, sounding completely exhausted. "Look, I know Chloe already talked to you. She told me her parents are moving into your East Wing next month. I want to hear it from you. Is that the plan you two have agreed to?" There was a heavy pause on the line. Much longer than I wanted. "It's complicated, Mom," Mark finally sighed. "Brenda keeps bringing up how Richard is sleeping on a couch with a bad back. They literally have nowhere else to go. Mom, I don't love it either, honestly, but we are suffocating in this apartment. Did you ask me, Mark?" I kept my voice perfectly steady. before Chloe told 14 family members that it was completely settled. I mean, no, not exactly. Chloe said she was going to handle talking to you. I sat with that for a second. The phone felt incredibly warm against my ear. I am not asking you to choose sides, Mark. I am asking you to remember exactly whose name is on the deed to that estate. I know, Mom, I know, he groaned. It's just, Chloe gets incredibly stressed out about her parents. And when she gets like that, it is just easier to let her handle things her way. That single sentence told me absolutely everything I needed to know. It is easier to let her handle things her way. I wondered how many massive, life-altering decisions in his marriage had been made under that exact same pathetic logic. Which luxury apartment to rent, which expensive car to lease, whether to visit his own mother for the holidays or spend it with her toxic family. Mark was not driving his own life, he was just a passenger in Chloe's aggressive pursuit of aesthetics. Think about it, I said softly. That is all I am asking you to do tonight. He didn't say anything for a while. I could hear him breathing heavily, and somewhere behind him, Chloe's voice demanding to know who he was talking to. I walked down to the beach the next morning with my coffee. The Pacific Ocean was churning, throwing white foam against the dark, jagged rocks. My neighbor, Victoria, a 72-year-old retired federal judge who owned the estate next door, was already out walking her golden retriever. Victoria's a woman who suffers absolutely no fools. She reads aggressive, historical biographies and drinks extremely dry martinis. In the 4 months I had lived there, she had become my closest confidant. You look like a woman who is calculating a hostile takeover, Victoria noted dryly, stopping at the property line. I told her everything, the group chat, the phone call, the blatant ultimatum, about going back to their apartment. Victoria listened without interrupting once. You do not owe anyone a single explanation for owning the property you paid for in cash. Evelyn, she said finally, adjusting her silk scarf. But you might want to put your refusal in writing anyway. Not because you will legally need it, but because it will prevent them from claiming squatters' rights if they manage to sneak a suitcase inside. In writing, I murmured, I know exactly who to call. That afternoon I called Priya Whitfield. She was a brilliant, incredibly sharp real estate attorney I had worked with during my liquidator days. She didn't do small-town favors, she executed ironclad corporate contracts. I explained the entire situation to her, the group chat announcement, the incoming moving date, the threat to send me back to the city apartment. Is the Monterey estate solely in your name? Priya asked, her keyboard clicking rapidly in the background. Solely mine, no joint ownership, no family trust yet. Then legally, absolutely nobody has the right to occupy that property without your explicit written consent. Priya confirmed. A deed is not a democracy, Evelyn. It does not matter what 14 people agreed to in an iMessage thread. If a moving truck pulls into my driveway, I asked, staring out at the ocean. Assuming it is already decided, what is the most effective legal countermeasure? I will draft a formal notice to vacate and a declaration of sole occupancy, Priya said clinically. You hand it to them before a single box crosses the threshold. It legally defines them as trespassers if they attempt to stay. Draft it, I instructed, but Priya, I need you to draft a second document. What kind of document? I smiled. It was the cold, terrifying smile of a corporate liquidator who had just found the ultimate leverage. The luxury penthouse apartment in San Francisco, where Mark and Chloe currently live. The one they lease for $500 a month, I said slowly. They think they lease it from a massive corporate management company called Vanguard Holdings. Priya stopped typing. Let me guess, you are Vanguard Holdings. I bought the building 3 years ago. I confirmed. I own their apartment. They just told me that if I don't let their parents take my $3 million estate, I can go back to living in their guest room. I want a 30-day notice to vacate drafted for their penthouse. Signed by me, the actual landlord. Priya actually laughed, a sharp, brilliant sound of pure professional appreciation. Evelyn, that is absolutely lethal. I will have both documents finalized, notarized, and couriered to your estate by Friday. I didn't argue in the group chat. I didn't send a single defensive text message. I let them believe they had won. Over the next 2 weeks, Chloe planned the entire move in the open. She posted aesthetic Pinterest boards of how she was going to redecorate my east wing. She talked about hiring a local contractor to paint the walls a calming sage green. Every single time my phone buzzed with a new update, I just drank my coffee and watched the ocean. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes, silence is just patience with a massive deadline attached. Chloe invited me to dinner that Sunday. She framed it as a casual family get-together. But when I arrived at their San Francisco penthouse, it felt exactly like a hostile corporate ambush I had not agreed to attend. When I walked through the door, Richard and Brenda were already seated at the massive marble dining table. Chloe's younger sister, Sarah, a 24-year-old aspiring influencer who had never held a real job, was also there, tapping aggressively on her phone. Mark was hovering near the kitchen island, nursing a glass of bourbon. He looked exhausted. Chloe served an incredibly pretentious organic pasta dish and started talking before anyone had even picked up their forks. "We just think it makes the most sense for absolutely everyone," Chloe announced, swirling her wine glass. "My parents get stability and ocean air. You get help with the massive yard upkeep since honestly, 3 acres is way too much for one older person to manage. And honestly, it just keeps our family close." I let her finish. I ate a single bite of pasta. Richard stared intensely at his plate. "I think what makes sense for absolutely everyone," I said finally, my voice cutting through the dining room like a scalpel, "should probably include the person who actually owns the estate." The table went completely dead quiet. Sarah glanced up from her phone, looked at me, and then immediately looked back down, clearly terrified of the sudden tension. Chloe recovered incredibly fast. "Nobody is trying to leave you out of the conversation, Evelyn. We are just trying to handle the logistics so you don't have to stress about it." "It doesn't feel like a conversation, Chloe," I replied calmly. "It feels exactly like a corporate announcement I am supposed to catch up to." Brenda slammed her fork down on the marble table. "Why does everything with you have to be a massive negotiations, Evelyn? We are talking about my husband having a safe place to sleep, and you are acting like we are stealing your crown jewels." I didn't raise my voice, I didn't even blink. "I am not acting like you are stealing anything, Brenda. I am acting like you are making demands about a property you do not own. You have an entire east wing." Chloe practically shouted, losing her carefully crafted aesthetic composure. "We had nowhere else to go, and if you really hate it that much, I already told you, you can just move into our guest room here. We are offering you a compromise." I looked around the beautiful $500 a month penthouse. I looked at the exposed brick walls I legally owned. I looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows my LLC paid the property taxes on. "We are offering you a compromise." The sheer, spectacular audacity of offering me a room in a building I literally owned, in exchange for stealing my $3 million coastal estate. "I appreciate the offer, Chloe," I said softly, picking up my linen napkin and dabbing my mouth. "But I have no intention of living in your guest room." I stood up from the table. Mark stepped forward, his face pale. "Mom, you don't have to leave yet. I have some incredibly important legal documents to review tonight, Mark," I said, picking up my purse. "Thank you for the pasta." I walked out of the penthouse. I didn't slam the door, I just let it click shut behind me. Gary hadn't spoken a single word during the entire dinner. He had just stared at his plate, letting his wife and his daughter build this massive, toxic decision entirely around him. The same way he had let Brenda carry the bitter anger about the SUV loan for 4 years, instead of addressing it himself. His silence wasn't cruelty, but it wasn't innocence either. Silence rarely is in families like ours. It just gets mistaken for peace until the massive bill finally comes due. I drove back down Highway 1 to Monterey with the radio completely off. Just the sound of the tires on the asphalt, and the dark ocean crashing against the cliffs in the distance. On Wednesday, 3 days before the moving trucks were scheduled to arrive, Priya's courier delivered the thick manila folder to my front gates. I sat at my massive mahogany dining table and reviewed the documents. Document 1, the Declaration of Sole Occupancy. and the formal notice to vacate for the Monterey estate. Stamped, notarized, and legally ironclad Document 2. A certified 30-day eviction notice for Unit 402 at the Vanguard Luxury Lofts in San Francisco. The landlord listed was Vanguard Holdings LLC. The authorized signatory for Vanguard Holdings was Evelyn Vance. I traced my signature on the bottom line. It was small, sharp, and perfectly steady. I slid both documents into a simple canvas tote bag, right next to the biometric safe that held the actual deed to the estate. Chloe texted me on Thursday morning. The moving truck is officially booked for Saturday at 9:00 a.m. My parents' stuff will start arriving. I really hope you are not going to make this difficult and ruin everyone's weekend. I read it twice. I didn't call her. I didn't try to reason with her one last time. You cannot negotiate with a parasite. You can only surgically remove it. I typed exactly one line back. I will be there on Saturday. No emojis, no explanation. Just a simple irrefutable fact. Her reply came instantly. Great. Thank you so much for finally understanding. This is going to be so good for everyone, I promise. I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. I will be there. It was not an agreement. It was a guarantee. Chloe read into it whatever she desperately needed to read into it. The exact same way she had read my silence over the past 6 weeks, as eventual surrender. She had mistaken my quiet patience for weakness. Friday afternoon, I walked next door to see Victoria. She was sitting on her patio, sipping a very dry martini, and reading a massive biography of Winston Churchill. They are arriving tomorrow at 9:00 a.m., I told her, accepting the second glass she pushed across the table. Victoria adjusted her reading glasses. Do you have the paperwork? I have 2 sets of paperwork, I replied, taking a slow sip. One to protect my house and one to dismantle hers. Victoria actually smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant expression. Evelyn, if I were still on the bench, I would buy a front-row ticket to this execution. Do you want me to stand near the property line tomorrow? Just keep watering your hydrangeas, I said softly. I want an independent witness when the truck pulls up. That night I sat on my teak deck for a long time. The Pacific Ocean was completely black, stretching out forever under a massive canopy of cold stars. I thought about the 32 years I had spent dismantling bankrupt corporations. I thought about the screaming men in expensive suits who had tried to intimidate me, and how easily I had legally crushed them. I thought about the massive commercial warehouse in Oakland I had liquidated to buy this estate. I thought about Thomas, holding my hand in that hospital room, telling me to build something that was mine alone. None of it had been about winning a petty argument. It had been about refusing to let entitled, toxic people make decisions I hadn't actually agreed to. Tomorrow, a moving truck would pull into my massive driveway, believing it had already won. I was going to let it arrive, I just wasn't going to let it stay on anyone's terms but my own. I went to bed at 10 o'clock and somewhat to my own surprise, I slept absolutely perfectly. Saturday morning, 8:55 a.m., the heavy marine layer was still burning off the coastline when a massive, rented commercial moving truck turned onto my private road. The gravel popped loudly under its heavy tires. Richard was driving the truck. Brenda was following closely behind in her luxury sedan. Mark and Chloe arrived 3 minutes later in his leased Porsche. Next door, Victoria stood at her stone fence line, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat, holding a silver watering can. She was aggressively watering a patch of succulents that absolutely did not need watering. She caught my eye across the property line and gave me a single, deliberate nod. The kind 2 women exchange when only one of them fully understands the absolute devastation that is about to happen. I stood on my front porch. I wore a simple tailored navy blue cashmere sweater and pearl earrings. I didn't look angry. I looked like a woman who owned exactly what she was standing on. Chloe jumped out of the Porsche, holding a massive iced coffee. She looked around my estate, like she was already planning the magazine spread. "Evelyn, we are here," she yelled, waving her manicured hand. She turned immediately to the 2 hired movers stepping out of the truck. "Okay guys, the master bedroom is for Evelyn, but all of these boxes need to go straight down the left hallway to the east wing." The movers nodded, pulling down the heavy metal ramp. Richard started unlatching the back of the truck. Brenda was already walking up my front steps, trying to push past me to open the heavy mahogany front door. "Excuse me, Brenda," I said, stepping directly into the center of the doorway. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't scream, but 32 years of corporate liquidation experience was layered into that single sentence. Brenda stopped dead in her tracks. I reached down and picked up the simple canvas tote bag sitting on the porch swing next to me. I pulled out the thick, navy blue folder before anyone brings a single cardboard box onto this property, I said, my voice carrying clearly over the sound of the crashing ocean waves behind the house. "I need everyone to hear something." Chloe rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic, aggressive sigh. "Evelyn, please do not be dramatic right now. We have a massive commercial truck rented by the hour, and the movers are on the clock. Can we just do this?" "I am not being dramatic, Chloe," I said softly. "I am being legally precise." I opened the folder. I didn't reach for the second document yet. I started with the first. "This is the official deed to this estate," I said, holding up the heavy paper so the embossed county seal caught the morning sunlight. "It has exactly one name on it, Evelyn Vance, not Mark Vance, not a family trust, mine. Purchased 4 months ago, entirely in cash and recorded at the county courthouse." Nobody spoke. Richard's hand froze on the metal latch of the moving truck. The color began to slowly drain from Mark's face. "This second document," I continued, pulling out the notarized legal paper Priya had drafted, "is a formal declaration of sole occupancy and a legal notice to vacate. It states that any individual attempting to occupy this property beyond a short visit requires my explicit written consent. Nobody currently standing in this driveway has that consent. If you carry a single box across this threshold, my attorney has instructed the local sheriff's department to remove you as trespassers." The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the massive Pacific Ocean crashing against the cliffs behind my house. Chloe's aesthetic composure completely shattered. The breezy influencer mask fell off, revealing the toxic, furious entitlement underneath. "Are you completely insane right now?" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing across the pristine driveway. "You let us pack an entire storage unit. You let us rent a commercial tow truck and drive 2 hours out here, just to humiliate my parents in front of hired movers." "I didn't ask anyone to pack a single box," I replied, keeping my voice terrifyingly level. "I watched it happen, because I wanted all of you to clearly understand the difference between what was actually legally true and what you simply decided was true in a group chat." Brenda's face flushed a deep, furious red. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Evelyn, we have nowhere else to go. We are completely terrified." "Fear does not excuse an ultimatum, Brenda," I answered smoothly. Chloe marched up the front steps, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "If you do this, Evelyn, I swear to God you are completely dead to us. If you turn my parents away today, you will never, ever set foot in our apartment again. We will completely ban you from our home. Do you understand me?" I looked at her. I looked at the furious, entitled young woman who had just threatened to ban me from a luxury penthouse she paid $8,500 a month to live in. I smiled. It was the exact same smile I used to give arrogant corporate CEOs right before I liquidated their entire life's work. "That actually brings me to the third document," I said softly. I reached into the folder one last time. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of certified legal paper. I didn't hand it to Chloe. I bypassed her entirely and handed it directly to my son, Mark. Mark took the paper. His hands were visibly shaking. He stared at the bold, capitalized letters at the top of the page. "Mark, why don't you read the header for your wife?" I suggested. Mark swallowed hard. His voice came out as a hollow, terrified whisper. 30-day notice to vacate. Unit 402, Vanguard Luxury Lofts, San Francisco." Chloe snatched the paper out of his hands. "What is this? Why do you have an eviction notice for our apartment?" she demanded, her eyes darting frantically across the legal text. She read the bottom line, then she stopped breathing entirely. "Landlord, Vanguard Holdings LLC." Chloe read aloud, her voice trembling. "Authorized signatory, Evelyn Vance." She looked up at me, absolute horror washing over her face. You told me that if I didn't like you taking my $3 million mansion, I could go back to living in your guest room. I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the lethal weight of absolute authority. I want to be incredibly clear about something, Chloe. It is not your guest room, it is not your apartment. I bought that entire building 3 years ago, with cash from a liquidated commercial warehouse. I am Vanguard Holdings, I am your landlord. Mark staggered backward, bumping into the hood of his leased Porsche. He looked like he had been physically struck in the chest. You cannot ban me from my own property, I continued, staring directly into Chloe's terrified eyes. But I can legally evict you from it for threatening your landlord. And I just did. You have exactly 30 days to clear out your organic pasta, your massive velvet couch, and your aesthetic lifestyle. Your lease is officially terminated. The hired movers standing by the truck slowly backed away. One of them actually pulled out his phone, pretending to check a text message, desperately trying to become invisible. Next door, Victoria had completely stopped watering her plants. She was standing perfectly still, watching the absolute execution taking place in my driveway. You own our building? Mark choked out, the realization finally crushing him. You own the penthouse? I own the penthouse, the lobby, and the underground parking garage where you park your leased car. I confirmed coldly. I built an empire while you were busy trying to please a woman who treats me like a disposable checkbook. Richard leaned heavily against the side of the moving truck. He finally understood. He had spent his entire life making terrible financial decisions, assuming someone else would always cover the fallout. He had convinced himself that Evelyn Vance was just a quiet widow he could easily steamroll. Now, he was looking at a financial titan who had just surgically dismantled his daughter's entire fake existence in less than 3 minutes. Mom, Mark begged, stepping forward, his eyes filling with tears. Please, we won't have anywhere to go. Rents in the city are insane right now. We can't afford a new deposit on 30 days' notice. You should have asked more questions before you let your wife announce her hostile takeover of my estate. I told my son, you allowed her to make an ultimatum because you assumed I was weak. You mistook my patience for surrender. It's just a house, Evelyn. Brenda sobbed from the driveway. We're family. It is never just a house, Brenda, I replied sharply. It is the only thing I have ever bought entirely on my own terms, without anyone else's approval required. And you tried to steal it. Chloe was completely paralyzed. She stood on my front steps holding the eviction notice, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the spectacular collapse of her reality. She had driven to Monterey, expecting to claim an oceanfront east wing for her Instagram feed. Instead, she was driving back to the city to pack up her own apartment. I looked at Richard and Brenda standing by the moving truck. They looked incredibly small, terrified, and completely out of options. I am a ruthless liquidator, but I am not a monster. Richard, Brenda, I said, projecting my voice across the driveway. They both looked up. I have a detached 2-bedroom guest cottage near the edge of the property, I told them. It is fully furnished. I will allow you to move your boxes into the cottage today. You may stay there for exactly 14 days, not 14. My attorney will email you a temporary occupancy agreement by noon. If you are not completely moved out by the 14th day, the sheriff will remove you. Brenda opened her mouth to argue, to demand the east wing, to complain about the cottage, but Richard grabbed her arm tightly. Thank you, Evelyn, Richard said, his voice breaking. We accept the cottage, thank you. Chloe didn't say a single word. She couldn't. Her entire identity, her entire aesthetic illusion of wealth, had been completely shattered. She walked down the steps, got into the passenger seat of the Porsche, and slammed the door. She sat there staring straight ahead, refusing to look at me. Mark lingered on the steps for a moment. He looked at the heavy mahogany door, the pearl earrings, the legal folder in my hands. He finally saw the woman his father had loved. I'm so sorry, Mom, he whispered, wiping a tear from his face. I should have stopped her, you should have, I agreed softly, but you didn't. You have 30 days. Mark, use them wisely. If you think Chloe was simply going to drive back to the city, quietly pack her expensive aesthetic belongings, and gracefully accept her massive defeat, then you do not understand the terrifying psychology of a completely entitled narcissist. A narcissist does not accept accountability. When the floor collapses underneath them, they immediately attempt to convince the entire world that you are the one who violently pushed them off the ledge. By Sunday afternoon, just 24 hours after the explosive confrontation in my driveway, my phone began to buzz incessantly. It wasn't Mark, it was the Vance family group chat. The same group chat that had gleefully celebrated the hostile takeover of my estate was now completely melting down. Sarah, Chloe's younger sister, sent the first message. I literally cannot believe what I am hearing, Evelyn. Did you seriously evict Mark and Chloe from their own apartment? How could you do something so incredibly cruel to your own family? An aunt from Sacramento chimed in 3 minutes later. Evelyn, please tell me this is a massive misunderstanding. Mark called his uncle crying, You cannot put them on the street. I didn't type a single word back. I just watched the messages flood the screen. They were absolutely frantic. They were demanding explanations, demanding grace, demanding that I act like a proper mother and fix the catastrophic mess that Chloe had created. Then Victoria texted me a single screenshot from next door. Check her Instagram, the message read. I opened the application. Chloe had posted a massive, highly produced video to her 50,000 followers. She was sitting in the Vanguard penthouse, wearing a simple, neutral-toned sweater, completely devoid of makeup, and crying. The lighting was perfectly adjusted to make her look incredibly vulnerable. Hey guys, she sniffled into the camera, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. I didn't want to bring this to the internet, but Mark and I are going through a completely devastating family crisis. We are being illegally and maliciously evicted from our beautiful apartment by a toxic family member who secretly bought our building just to control us. We are completely heartbroken. Please send prayers as we try to survive this. She didn't name me directly, but she didn't have to. The comment section was a massive, chaotic echo chamber of sympathy. Thousands of strangers were attacking the evil landlord, offering her emotional support, and begging her to start a GoFundMe. She was trying to use the internet to bully me into submission. She thought the public pressure would force me to retract the eviction. She completely forgot that I spent 32 years destroying aggressive corporate smear campaigns. I didn't respond on Instagram. I didn't defend myself in the family group chat. I picked up my phone, called Priya Whitfield, and forwarded her the video. Priya, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I need you to pull the Vanguard Luxury Lofts Master Lease Agreement. Specifically, Section 14, Paragraph C. I could hear Priya typing aggressively, Section 14, the Corporate Non-Disparagement and Confidentiality Clause. Exactly, I confirmed. Vanguard Holdings requires all luxury tenants to sign a strict non-disparagement agreement regarding the property management and ownership entity. Chloe just broadcasted a completely defamatory, legally actionable claim of illegal eviction to 50,000 people. She just handed you a loaded weapon, Evelyn, Priya noted, her voice carrying a sharp edge of professional delight. Draft the cease and desist, I instructed. I want it sent to her via certified digital delivery and physical courier by 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. Inform her that if the video is not permanently deleted within exactly 1 hour of receipt, Vanguard Holdings will file a massive civil defamation lawsuit against her Interior Design LLC, seeking catastrophic financial damages. And Priya, yes, Evelyn, remind her that as her landlord, I already have completely unhindered access to her entire financial history. She cannot afford a legal war of attrition. Monday morning, 8 a.m. I was sitting on my teak deck, drinking coffee, watching the ocean. At exactly 8:14 a.m., the Instagram video completely vanished from the internet. Not archived, permanently deleted. At 8:16 a.m., my phone rang. It was Mark. I let it ring 3 times before I finally answered. Mom, Mark choked out. His voice was completely shattered. It was the sound of a man who had finally realized that the massive, burning building he was trapped inside was entirely of his own making. Please, we need to meet. Chloe is having a complete panic attack. She thinks Vanguard Holdings is going to sue her business into bankruptcy. Vanguard Holdings absolutely will sue her into bankruptcy if she continues to publicly defame a completely legal eviction process. Mark, I replied clinically. Mom, please, he begged. I know we messed up, I know it, but please, can we just sit down and talk about this? Face to face, we will do whatever you want. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I listened to the massive waves crashing against the rocks. I will meet with you, Mark, I said finally. But I will not meet with you as your mother. I will meet with you as your landlord. You and Chloe will be at Priya Whitfield's law office in downtown San Francisco tomorrow at exactly 10:00 a.m. Do not be late. We will be there, he promised desperately. Thank you, Mom. Do not call me Mom during this negotiation. I corrected him sharply. You traded your mother for an aesthetic lifestyle. Tomorrow, you are meeting with the consequence. I hung up the phone. Tuesday morning, 9:55 a.m., I sat perfectly straight at the head of the massive, heavy glass conference table in Priya Whitfield's corporate law office. The room smelled of expensive espresso and polished leather. Priya sat to my right, her laptop open, a thick financial dossier resting neatly on the table between us. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit. I didn't look like a mother arriving to discipline her children. I looked exactly like a corporate liquidator, preparing to sign the final death warrant of a bankrupt entity. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy glass doors opened. Mark and Chloe walked in. They looked absolutely terrible. Mark was wearing a wrinkled suit jacket, his eyes bloodshot, his posture completely defeated. Chloe walked slightly behind him, the arrogant, breezy influencer, who had aggressively commanded hired movers in my driveway, just 3 days earlier was completely gone. She looked small, terrified, and entirely stripped of her fake aesthetic power. They sat down at the opposite end of the massive table. The physical distance between us was entirely intentional. Good morning, Priya said, her voice perfectly clinical. Let the record reflect that this meeting is being conducted between Vanguard Holdings LLC and the current tenants of Unit 402. Mark cleared his throat nervously. He looked at me, desperately searching for any trace of maternal warmth. He found absolutely none. Evelyn, Mom, Mark started, his voice shaking. We are here to formally apologize. We were completely out of line on Saturday. The ultimatum, the group chat, it was completely wrong. We know that now, Chloe nodded frantically, tears welling in her eyes. We are so incredibly sorry, Evelyn. We just panicked about my parents. We didn't mean to disrespect you. I remained perfectly still. I let their pathetic, rehearsed apologies hang in the cold air of the conference room. We want to negotiate a new lease, Mark continued desperately, pushing a small piece of paper across the glass table. We will pay the full market rent. We will sign whatever addendum you want, please. Just let us keep the apartment. We cannot afford to move right now. I looked down at the piece of paper, then I looked at Priya. She slid the thick financial dossier across the table until it rested directly in front of Mark. Open it, I commanded softly. Mark hesitated, then flipped open the heavy cover. He stared at the spreadsheets, the rent rolls, and the comparative market analyses I had explicitly ordered Priya to prepare. Let me explain exactly how incredibly bad your mathematics are, Mark, I said, leaning slightly forward, resting my hands on the glass. You currently pay Vanguard Holdings $8,500 a month for that luxury penthouse. Yes, and we have never missed a payment. Chloe interjected eagerly, trying to grasp at a lifeline. You haven't missed a payment because I made it artificially easy for you, I corrected her, my voice dropping like a heavy stone. The actual open market rate for a top-floor penthouse with exposed brick and ocean views in that specific downtown zip code is $12,500 a month. I have been quietly subsidizing your rent by exactly $4,000 a month for the last 3 years. Mark's jaw dropped, the color completely vanished from Chloe's face. You didn't build a luxury lifestyle. I continued, surgically dismantling their entire reality. You leased it using my invisible capital. You used the $4,000 a month I was secretly giving you to lease a completely unnecessary Porsche. You used it to buy designer handbags, expensive organic pasta, and to fund an aesthetic interior design business that generates absolutely zero actual profit. I let the catastrophic numbers sink in. I watched the realization completely crush them. And how did you repay that incredibly generous subsidy? I asked, my voice turning to absolute ice. When you thought I was just a weak, fixed-income widow who couldn't defend herself, you orchestrated a hostile takeover of my $3 million coastal estate. You demanded that I house your bankrupt, financially irresponsible parents. And when you thought I might resist, you threatened to banish me to the guest room of the exact same apartment that I was secretly paying for. Chloe burst into aggressive, hysterical tears. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. I am so sorry, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know you owned it. That is exactly the problem, Chloe, I replied, showing absolutely zero mercy. You are not sorry that you treated me like a disposable, pathetic doormat. You are only sorry that the doormat turned out to be the landlord. You didn't respect me, you only respect power, Mom, please, Mark begged, tears openly streaming down his face. I am begging you, I am your son, we will change, I will sell the Porsche, just don't evict us. I looked at the son I had raised, I looked at the boy who had once refused to sign a toxic loan for Richard, but who had eventually allowed a toxic woman to completely override his moral compass. You are my son, Mark, I said softly, the corporate liquidator finally stepping back to let the mother speak for exactly one sentence. And that is exactly why I am doing this, because if I do not let this massive, burning building collapse on top of you right now, you will never ever learn how to build a real foundation for yourself. I stood up from the heavy glass table, I buttoned my charcoal suit jacket. There is no negotiation, I stated with absolute finality. Vanguard Holdings does not extend leases to hostile tenants. The eviction notice is entirely legally binding. You have exactly 26 days left to vacate Unit 402. Leave the keys on the kitchen counter when you go. This meeting is officially concluded. I didn't wait for them to respond. I turned around and walked out of the massive glass conference room, leaving them sitting at the table, completely alone in the wreckage of their own entitlement. By Thursday of that same week, the massive fallout began. The reality of their financial ruin could no longer be hidden behind an Instagram filter. Mark voluntarily surrendered the leased Porsche to the dealership. He couldn't afford the massive monthly payment without my secret rent subsidy, and he desperately needed whatever cash he could salvage to secure a new apartment. Chloe was forced to list her expensive designer handbags and her pristine aesthetic furniture on an online resale marketplace. She had to sell the exact same luxury items she had used to belittle me at Thanksgiving. The family group chat, which had been a chaotic war zone just days earlier, went completely, terrifyingly silent. The Sacramento aunt, the cousins, the flying monkeys, they all realized that if they pushed me, they might be the next ones to discover exactly how much power I was quietly holding. They finally understood that I was not a woman they could intimidate. And that brings us to the final deadline. Mark turned around, walked slowly down the front steps, and got into the driver's seat of the Porsche. He didn't look back. The car reversed down the long gravel driveway and disappeared through the massive iron front gates. The luxury illusion they had aggressively maintained for 5 years was officially driving away in absolute silence. I turned my attention to the hired movers. Gentlemen, I said, pointing toward a small stone path leading away from the main house. The guest cottage is down that walkway. You may unload the truck there. I didn't stay on the porch to supervise them. I didn't need to. I had successfully defended my perimeter, and my terms had been unequivocally accepted. I turned around, walked into my beautiful $3.5 million estate, and pulled the heavy mahogany front door shut behind me. The door did not slam, it clicked, a small, precise sound, the sound of a heavy brass latch catching perfectly. It was the sound of absolute finality. That is how you know someone has reclaimed their territory forever. I walked into my kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I watched the movers carry Richard and Brenda's boxes down the stone path to the cottage. Victoria was still standing in her garden next door. I raised my coffee mug toward the property line. She raised her silver watering can in a silent, spectacular salute. Richard and Brenda stayed in the guest cottage for exactly 14 days. They signed the temporary occupancy agreement Priya emailed them that very afternoon. Not a single complaint was uttered. The massive, toxic entitlement that had fueled their entire family dynamic had been completely extinguished in my driveway. On day 12, I walked down to the cottage with a folder of paperwork. Not legal notices this time. I had used my extensive real estate connections to find a highly subsidized senior apartment complex in a modest, affordable town about 40 minutes inland. I sat at the small cottage table with Richard and Brenda and helped them fill out the application. They were incredibly quiet. Brenda didn't make a single passive-aggressive comment. Richard thanked me 3 times before I left. They moved into their new modest apartment on day 14, exactly as the contract stipulated. Nobody was left standing in the street. Nobody was permanently homeless. I made absolutely sure of that. But they finally got the terrifying truth in writing, with a hard deadline attached. And sometimes, that is the most permanent consequence of all. As for Mark and Chloe, the 30-day eviction notice was executed flawlessly. Mark called me on day 22, his voice exhausted and completely devoid of ego. He told me that Chloe had thrown a massive temper tantrum in the penthouse when she realized she could no longer post photos of her exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows on Instagram. She had demanded that Mark simply figure it out and rent them a new luxury loft. But Mark couldn't figure it out. His architecture salary was already stretched to the absolute breaking point, just covering the leased Porsche and Chloe's massive credit card bills. Without the heavily subsidized, below-market rent I had secretly been charging them at Vanguard luxury lofts, they were entirely priced out of downtown San Francisco. They moved out on day 30. They signed a lease on a tiny, incredibly modest one-bedroom apartment in a noisy suburb an hour outside the city. It cost them exactly $2,400 a month. It had low ceilings, beige carpet, and absolutely zero aesthetic appeal. Chloe's Instagram account went completely dark for 3 months. She lost her luxury interior designer persona overnight because she could no longer use my building as her fake portfolio. Mark also told me that they had started seeing a licensed marriage counselor, a professional who was actively forcing them to unpack the massive, toxic dynamic of Chloe's entitlement and Mark's absolute cowardice. He didn't ask me for a single dollar to help pay for the deposit on their new apartment. For the very first time in his adult life, my son was actually standing on his own 2 feet. Because I had finally stopped quietly, building the floor underneath him. Nobody got unfairly punished, nobody went to federal court, nobody lost a home permanently without a backup plan. I handled the situation with the exact same ruthless precision I used to liquidate bankrupt corporations. I simply restructured their existence, removed myself as their financial collateral, and legally secured my own borders. 3 weeks after Richard and Brenda moved out of the guest cottage, I walked down to the edge of the cliffs behind my estate. The evening air was cold, smelling heavily of salt and pine needles. The Pacific Ocean was crashing aggressively against the rocks below, sending massive plumes of white water into the darkening sky. It was the exact same sound I had been chasing since the very first day I walked through this estate with a real estate agent. It was the sound Thomas and I had promised each other we would eventually find. I stood at the edge of the cliff, the coastal wind pulling at my sweater. I thought about the 32 years I had spent teaching screaming men in boardrooms that my silence was not a weakness. I thought about how easily that exact same lesson had been lost somewhere between my corporate retirement and my own family's dining table. They thought I didn't understand leverage because I never talked about money. I understood money better than anyone they had ever met. I just never felt the pathetic, desperate need to prove it to them. I spent my entire adult life knowing that boundaries and kindness can exist in the exact same sentence. It just took a rented moving truck in my own driveway to finally teach that lesson to the entitled adults in my family. I touched the pearl earrings I always wore. I felt Thomas's memory standing quietly beside me on the cliffs. Whatever you build after I am gone, Evelyn, you build it so it is yours outright. I looked back at the massive, glowing windows of the East Wing. It was completely empty, it was perfectly silent, it was entirely, unequivocally mine, no longer borrowed against someone else's toxic plan. No longer a backup option for a family that treated my generosity like an infinite checking account. If you are a woman who has spent her life being the quiet, reliable foundation for an ungrateful family, if you are the one who pays the bills, manages the chaos, and silently endures the microaggressions while they demand the keys to your kingdom, hear this incredibly clearly. Your silence is not a surrender. It is an administrative pause. Keep working, keep building your quiet empire, keep documenting absolutely everything in a heavy steel safe. And when they finally push you too far, do not scream. Do not beg them to respect your boundaries. Smile, hand them the eviction notice to their own fake reality, and walk away. Thank you so much for reading. Please share this story if you have ever had to legally dismantle a toxic situation to protect your peace. And do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of absolute justice. I will see you in the next one. The silence was absolute. The silence was absolute.